There is a story running underneath Steven Universe like a current beneath still water. It is not the loudest thing in the show. It doesn't announce itself. It lets you watch 5 seasons of a boy with a magic gem learning to summon shields and make friends and fight monsters. And then it quietly reveals that the whole time, something genuinely dark was sitting at the center of everything. Not dark in a gratuitous way, not shock for the sake of it. Dark in the way that real things are dark, the way that harm passed down through generations is dark. The way that love and control can look nearly identical from a certain angle, and how the difference between the two only becomes clear long after the damage is already done. This is the story of Pink Diamond. It is also the story of Pearl, of Spinel, of Bismuth, of corruption and silence and a faked death that broke the world, and of a boy born into the wreckage of all of it who had to figure out what to do with something he never asked to carry. You don't need to have seen every episode to follow this. If you have, I think there's something in here worth sitting with again. If you haven't, everything you need to know, I'll give you as we go. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you want. This one takes a while and it's better slow. If you're watching this late at night or early in the morning or somewhere in between where the world feels a little quieter and softer and more forgiving than usual, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I'd love to know. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly this kind of thing. Long, unhurried looks at the stories that stay with you. There's more coming. All right, let's begin. Part 1. Before Earth, the diamond who didn't fit. To understand why the story of Pink Diamond is disturbing, you have to understand what the world she was born into looked like. And that requires spending a little time on Homeworld, which is the seat of power for the Gem civilization. An alien empire that has been colonizing planets across the galaxy for longer than human history has existed. Homeworld operates on a single foundational principle. Every gem has a purpose. You are grown in a kindergarten, which is what they call the vast industrial operations they carve into the surfaces of planets. And the purpose you emerge with is the only purpose you are ever meant to have. Rubies are soldiers. Pearls are servants. Paradots are technicians. Sapphires have limited future vision and serve as advisors to the powerful. Each type has a rank, and the ranks are rigid, and deviation from the system is not just discouraged. It is treated as a kind of profound wrongness, the thing Homeworld calls being defective. At the very top of this system sit the diamonds, 4 of them forming what they call the Great Diamond Authority: white, yellow, blue, and pink. They are the rulers of everything. Their authority is absolute. Their image is stamped into the architecture of Homeworld, their insignia painted across every surface. Their voices carrying a weight that is not metaphorical. Diamonds have a power over lower gems that is literal, a kind of compulsion baked into the fundamental hierarchy of gem society. White Diamond is the most powerful, the most ancient, the most feared. She is depicted throughout the show in near monochromatic tones, drawn slightly differently than other gems, her face more expressive, her authority so total that even yellow and blue seem to bend under its weight. Yellow Diamond is the Empire's military arm. Cold, efficient, impatient, with an edge of grief she has never learned to process except through work. Blue Diamond is the diplomat, the mourner, the keeper of history and culture. Her emotional powers so strong that they bleed into the feelings of every gem around her. And then there is Pink Diamond, who is smaller than the others, who was given the lowest place in the hierarchy, not by her own failures, but by the simple fact that she was the youngest, the newest, the one who hadn't yet been given a colony of her own, the one who wasn't taken seriously. What the show eventually reveals about Pink's life on Homeworld before she was given Earth is genuinely difficult to sit with, because it has the texture of something recognizable. She wanted to belong. She wanted to be seen as capable, as equal, as real. She asked Yellow and Blue for a colony of her own again, and they kept saying no. Not because they didn't care about her, but because in their version of caring, she was still too young, too inexperienced, too impulsive. They were, from their own perspective, protecting her, and the protection looked like a cage. When she finally went directly to White Diamond and asked, White turned her down as well, saying she wasn't fit to run a colony. The language is worth dwelling on. Not fit. As if being denied were a statement of fact, rather than a decision made by someone with more power than she had. Pink Diamond responded the way a child responds when pushed past the edge of what she can contain. She had a destructive outburst, and in the process, she cracked the gemstone of her first pearl. A gem who had been assigned to her as a servant, but who she had treated more like a companion, someone she goofed around with in private, someone she actually liked. The crack wasn't intentional. Pink was standing near her when the force of the outburst hit. The damage manifested not in the pearl's actual gemstone, but in her physical form. Psychological trauma so severe it expressed itself as a physical scar that no healing could undo. It crept across the pearl's left eye and down her cheek and through her hair, and it was still there 5,000 years later when Stephen finally met her. Pink Diamond cracked her own companion and didn't mean to. That is the kind of detail that doesn't have a clean moral reading. It isn't monstrous. It isn't blameless. It's something worse than either. It's the consequence of a being who had enormous power and no real tools for managing her own emotional states, because no one in her life had ever helped her develop any. White Diamond, upon seeing what happened to the pearl, took her away. This is presented in the show as a punishment, which is probably what White believed it was. What it actually amounted to was taking away one of Pink's only genuine companions and replacing her with a new pearl, one who was more formal, more proper, more correct, and thus someone Pink couldn't fully relax around in the same way. And then, as a kind of consolation, or distraction, or simply because Pink needed something to keep her occupied, Spinel was created. A gem designed specifically to play with Pink, to keep her company, to be her friend. We will get to Spinel in detail later. Her story is one of the most quietly devastating threads in the entire show. But for now, what matters is that Pink Diamond's early life on Homeworld was a sequence of rejections and punishments and substitutions and a persistent message, delivered in the language of love and care and discipline, that who she was and what she wanted were not quite right. She was repeatedly imprisoned in what the show calls the prison tower when she misbehaved. Blue Diamond would come to scold her, and the show depicts Blue doing this with what she genuinely believed was affection and necessity, and Pink sitting there crying. The same prison tower she would later find Stephen locked inside when he arrived on Homeworld, over 5,000 years after she left. The architecture of control doesn't change because the person doing the controlling loves you. That is one of the things this story is actually about. It is important to understand that the Diamonds were not villains in the way that word usually functions. They weren't cruel in the way a monster is cruel. They genuinely loved Pink. They grieved her when they believed her gone, with an intensity that was real and total, and that expressed itself in catastrophic ways because none of them had ever learned how to hold grief without drowning in it. Blue Diamond wept so constantly in the millennia after Pink's supposed death that her emotional aura made every gem around her miserable with secondhand sorrow. Yellow Diamond buried herself in work and efficiency and the expansion of empire because forward motion was the only form of not feeling she had access to. They loved Pink. They also trapped her. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the show is honest enough to not resolve that contradiction, because in the real world, those two things coexist all the time. Love and control, care and captivity, affection and the slow suffocation of someone who just needed room to be themselves. Eventually, Pink was given Earth. She had wanted a colony for so long. She had asked so many times. She had been denied so many times. And then finally, the answer was yes. A planet of her own to colonize, armies of her own to command, an injector program already underway to begin the extraction of gem material from Earth's crust. She was given this, and she went. And the first thing she felt when she arrived on Earth was wonder. Part 2. The Planet. She fell in love. With the colonization of a planet in Gem Society is a precise and terrible process. Injectors are driven into the ground like enormous needles, and they pull nutrients from the planet's crust to grow new gems in chambers carved out of the rock. The gems who emerge from this process are powerful and numerous and useful to the Empire. The planet that hosts this process becomes a dead thing, stripped, hollowed, unable to sustain life. That is the cost, and it had always been the cost. And for thousands of years of Homeworld's history, no one in a position to stop it had ever questioned whether the cost was acceptable. Pink Diamond arrived on Earth expecting to feel pride. She had earned this. She had fought for it. She had waited for it. A colony of her own to add to the Empire and prove herself worthy of the Diamond name. What she actually felt when she arrived and walked through the forests and the fields and the ancient coastlines of a planet thick with life in every direction, the insects and the birds and the waves, and the organic chaos of a world that had been quietly becoming itself for billions of years, was something she hadn't prepared for. The show captures this in fragments, in memories that other gems share, in the slowly assembled picture of a being who arrived expecting to conquer and instead became fascinated. Pink Diamond, who had lived on the crystalline perfection of Homeworld her entire existence, encountered Earth's wild, living, impermanent abundance and found it extraordinary. She looked at the humans beginning to develop on its surface and, instead of seeing raw material to be cleared away, saw the thing Rose Quartz would later describe to Greg Universe as magic. The capacity for change, for growth, for the invention of self. Gems don't change. That is fundamental to what they are. They emerge from kindergartens with a fixed form, a fixed purpose, a fixed place in the hierarchy. Their physical bodies are projections of their gemstones, infinitely reformable but always returning to the same shape. They can shapeshift, but they always come back to themselves. They do not age, they do not evolve, they do not look back at who they were 500 years ago and recognize that they are now someone different. Humans do all of that. And Pink Diamond, watching them from a world that had never given her room to be anyone other than what she was made to be, found it remarkable. She tried to stop the colonization. This is the part of the story that gets complicated because Pink didn't do it openly. She couldn't. She was a diamond. The colony was hers. The army that was already on Earth was hers. The injectors driving into the ground were hers. There was no mechanism by which Pink Diamond could simply say, "Actually, I've changed my mind. This planet is worth keeping." That was not how Homeworld worked. That was not a choice the system allowed. So she went to Yellow Diamond and to Blue Diamond and made arguments. She talked about the organic life. She talked about how the colonization was destroying something that couldn't be replaced. She asked them to reconsider. They told her no. They told her Earth was her responsibility, that she had asked for this colony, that she needed to see it through. Yellow was especially direct when sentimentality about organic life was not a relevant factor. The Empire needed the gems the Earth would produce. The colonization would continue. And Blue Diamond, who in her own way genuinely cared for Pink, responded to Pink's distress by doing something she believed was kind. She established a human zoo. She collected humans from Earth, early people 6,000 years ago, and placed them in a contained habitat in space, where they would be preserved and cared for, safe from the colonization that would eventually destroy their homeworld. Comfortable, provided for, perfectly managed. Trapped forever in a space station, orbiting a planet they would never see again, their descendants living out generations under artificial conditions, friendly gem attendants making sure they were comfortable and never letting them know what they were. The show finds this horrifying when Steven discovers it, and rightly so, but Blue Diamond designed it as an act of mercy. She was trying to help, in the way that systems of power always help, by absorbing the problem into the structure rather than questioning the structure itself. Pink kept asking. She tried subterfuge. She made the situation on Earth sound more difficult than it was, described resistance from the human population, exaggerated the logistical complications of the colonization. None of it worked. The answer was always keep going. And then Pearl, her new Pearl, the formal one, the replacement, suggested something. What if Pink Diamond went down to the surface in a different form? Not as herself. Not as a diamond. As one of the ordinary quartz gems being grown there, one of the soldiers meant to protect and serve the colony. What if she walked among them and saw Earth from the ground up, just for a day? Pink Diamond agreed. She shapeshifted. She became rose quartz. And something happened in that shapeshifted form that she hadn't planned on. She started to feel like someone who could actually do something. Not Pink Diamond, who was a diamond with all the restrictions and obligations and the crushing weight of the hierarchy bearing down. But Rose Quartz, who was a soldier, who was just a gem, who could talk to other gems as an equal, who could stand on the grass of this planet she was falling in love with and feel the full weight of what was about to be lost without having to immediately calculate what a diamond was supposed to feel about it. She started spending more and more time as Rose. She started talking to the gems around her. She found in those conversations that she wasn't the only one who saw something worth protecting in the life that covered this planet. She started making an argument she had never quite been able to make as herself. Not a petition to authority. Not a request that could be denied. An invitation to people who were already here to consider what they were part of. The crystal gems were born from that. The rebellion, which would last for thousands of years and reshape everything, started as Pink Diamond talking to people in a face that wasn't her own. That is where the story gets genuinely dark. Not because of what the rebellion became, though that was dark too, but because of what Rose Quartz was from the very beginning. She was a disguise worn by someone who couldn't get what she wanted as herself. Every gem who joined the Crystal Gems, who swore loyalty to Rose Quartz, who fought under her banner and took damage for her cause and in some cases was corrupted or shattered, because of that choice was following someone who wasn't who she said she was. None of them knew. Not for thousands of years. Not until a single pale rose changed everything. Part 3. The Rebellion and the Lie at its Heart. The Gem War lasted for a very long time. The show isn't precise about the duration, but the numbers that emerge from the background of various episodes suggest something in the range of several thousand years. That is not a typo. The conflict between the Crystal Gems and the forces of Homeworld stretched across a span of time that makes all of recorded human history look brief. During that time, Rose Quartz, Pink Diamond wearing a different face, led the rebellion. She recruited gems who had their own reasons for wanting something different. Garnet, a fusion of two gems named Ruby and Sapphire who fell in love, whose very existence violated Homeworld's rules about unauthorized fusions, and who chose to stay together rather than separate. Pearl, who had been assigned to Pink Diamond as a servant, and who chose over time to see herself as something other than what she had been made to be. Bismuth, a builder and metalworker who believed in the cause with a fervor born of genuine outrage at what the Empire had made of everyone in it. Amethyst, who wasn't part of the war at all because she was still growing underground during it, but who emerged 500 years after it ended into a world already changed by what these gems had done. The Crystal Gems fought to protect Earth. They also, because the Diamonds never stopped sending armies, fought to simply survive. Every gem bubbled in the show's present day was a soldier from one side or the other who was caught in combat, defeated and either captured or worse. The war was real and it was brutal, and it went on long enough that it became the defining context of every gem who lived through it. Pink Diamond maintained her double life throughout. Sometimes she was Pink Diamond, negotiating and performing the role of a reluctant colonial authority, still trying to end the colonization through official channels. Sometimes she was Rose Quartz, leading charges and making speeches and being the living symbol of a rebellion she herself had started. The logistics of this arrangement would have been staggering. The psychological weight of it must have been something else entirely. Consider what it means to simultaneously be the authority against which a rebellion is fighting and the leader of that rebellion. To stand across from yourself, in a sense. To fight yourself. To send armies against yourself and then, having retreated to the other face, to fight back against those armies. And to do all of this while keeping it a secret from every single person who trusted you. Pearl knew. Pearl was the only one who knew. And that knowledge would cost Pearl more than the show can fully account for. We'll get there. But everyone else, Garnet, Bismuth, every Quartz who ever swore loyalty to Rose Quartz, Every gem who fought and was damaged and gave up parts of themselves for the cause was following someone they didn't truly know. There is a question underneath that which the show raises and then leaves in the air. Does it matter? Does the source of the leadership diminish the justice of the cause? The Crystal Gems were fighting for something real. Earth was worth protecting. The colonization was wrong and destructive. The gem system that governed Homeworld was genuinely harmful to nearly everyone in it, including most of the diamonds who perpetuated it. Rose/Pink believed in those things. She fought for them. The cause was real even if the person leading it was a fiction. But there is also the specific harm of the deception. Not just the general philosophical problem of being led by someone who isn't who they say they are, but the very concrete, very personal costs borne by specific individuals because they didn't have information that was being deliberately withheld from them. Bismuth is the clearest example. She is the crystal gem we have to talk about most carefully because her story is the one that most directly indicts Rose in a way the show acknowledges but then quietly sets aside. Part 4. Bismuth and the question nobody answered. Bismuth is one of the original crystal gems. She's a builder, a metal worker, someone whose function is to reshape metal with her hands. She is also one of the most genuinely passionate characters in the show, someone who joined the rebellion not out of obligation or logic, but out of something closer to moral fury. The gem system had taken everything from gems like her and given it to those at the top, and she could not look at that arrangement and accept it as natural. She fought for the crystal gems with everything she had. She built Rose's sword, which could disrupt a gem's physical form without shattering the underlying gemstone. A non-lethal weapon specifically designed to allow the crystal gems to fight without killing. That detail is important because it reflects Rose's stated philosophy. We will not shatter. We are better than that. We will win this war without becoming what we are fighting against. The sword was Rose's most important weapon. Bismuth made it to Rose's specifications. She believed in the cause and she believed in Rose, and she put everything she had into both of those things. And then she spent millennia thinking about the math of the war. Thinking about the fact that while the crystal gems could poof Homeworld soldiers, force them back into their gemstones, leaving them temporarily defeated, those gems would always eventually regenerate, would always come back, would always regroup and return and keep fighting. The war could not end through poofing alone. There were always more Homeworld gems. The diamonds had resources the crystal gems couldn't match, and the diamonds themselves could not be poofed at all. Their power was too great. They were, in every conventional sense, impossible to stop. So Bismuth built something. She called it the breaking point, a weapon that could shatter a gem in a single strike. A weapon that, she claimed, could shatter even a diamond. She brought it to Rose. She explained the logic. This is how we end this. The diamonds cannot be deposed by force of arms, but if they can be permanently removed from the equation, the Empire loses its foundation. The war ends. Earth is saved. The gems freed from the system are freed permanently. Rose said no. This is the moment the show presents as morally clear, and in one sense it is. The position that you should not end another being's existence, even in the context of a war, is a real ethical position. It has weight. It is worth taking seriously. But here is what the show lets you notice if you're paying attention. Rose said no, not only because she believed the breaking point was wrong, she also said no because, as the hidden pink diamond, she was being asked to sanction a weapon specifically designed to shatter a diamond. A diamond. Her. The diamonds. She was being asked to arm the rebellion with a tool that could end her. Not as Rose, but as what she secretly was. There is no way to fully separate those motivations. Whether Rose's refusal was pure principle or partly self-preservation, or some blend of both that she herself couldn't have untangled, the show doesn't say. But it's there, in the structure of the situation, when you know what you know by the end. Bismuth couldn't accept the refusal. She and Rose argued. The argument turned physical. Rose ultimately poofed Bismuth, defeated her in combat, and then, instead of telling any of the other crystal gems what had happened, She placed Bismuth's gemstone in a bubble and hid her inside Lion's pocket dimension. She told everyone Bismuth had gone missing in the war. Missing. Not captured. Not sealed away. Missing. A word chosen to close the conversation without having it. Bismuth spent over 5,000 years in that bubble. The war ended. The corruption happened. The crystal gems dwindled to almost nothing. Beach City was built. Decades of human history unfolded. And Bismuth was in a bubble in a lion's mane, waiting, not knowing any of it. The other crystal gems of Pearl Garnet thought their friend was gone. They grieved her in whatever way they are capable of grief. They never knew she had been there all along, 500 meters away in a magical pocket dimension, conscious of nothing and missing everything. When Steven accidentally frees her in the show's 100th episode, she wakes up with all the warmth and fire she had before, ready to pick up where she left off. And the show gives her the episode she deserves. A full, rich, aching portrait of someone who has been living outside of time, who loved deeply and was betrayed by the person she loved, and who doesn't yet know the full shape of that betrayal. The deepest layer of it she only learns later when she finds out that Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. That the crystal gem leader she had been following was actually the very diamond whose colonization of Earth had started the whole problem. That she had, in some theoretical sense, built a weapon to destroy the leader of the crystal gems. And it turns out she almost gave Rose the idea to fake her own death. The show handles Bismuth's reaction to this revelation with a dark joke, a moment of exhausted irony. And then it moves on. The larger narrative is about healing and reconciliation, and Bismuth gets to be part of that. She joins the crystal gems again, she's there at the end, she hugs Pearl, she sets up a forge. That is all genuine and good, and the show means it. What doesn't happen is anyone addressing what Bismuth actually said. The question she raised when she built the breaking point, about the true costs of fighting a just war without certain weapons, about the lives that were lost and the gems that were corrupted because the crystal gems couldn't end the war decisively, that question is never answered. It hangs in the air of the narrative, acknowledged by the structure of events, and then the show turns to face the ending it has chosen and leaves the question standing there. That is not a failure, it's almost certainly intentional. The show is about the possibility of change and redemption and healing, and it has to be, because otherwise there is no story worth telling after the war. But Bismuth's question is the dark mark on the resolution, the thing that remains true even after the light comes back on. The war lasted as long as it did. The corruption claimed as many gems as it claimed, and at the center of it was a leader whose reasons for rejecting the breaking point were, at minimum, more complicated than she ever disclosed. Part 5. The Faked Death, What Pearl Agreed to Carry. Let's talk about what Rose actually did. Not who she was, not what she wanted, but the specific sequence of choices she made once she decided that being Pink Diamond was no longer sustainable. She faked her own death. The plan was Pearl's idea, or at least Pearl's suggestion gave Rose the shape of it. Pearl could shapeshift into Rose's form. She could carry a prop, a fake shattered diamond, a fragment of the right color and size to be convincing. And on a day when the right homeworld forces were present to witness it, Pearl in Rose's form could stage a shattering. Could appear to drive a weapon through the gemstone of Pink Diamond. Could sell it. And she did. Pearl shapeshifted into Rose Quartz, staged the apparent murder of Pink Diamond before witnesses who reported it back to Homeworld, and then shifted back to herself. Pink Diamond was dead. Rose Quartz had killed her. It worked. The Diamonds believed Pink was gone. They retreated from Earth, not gracefully, not cleanly, but they retreated. The war from that point had a different shape. There was no Diamond on Earth to fight. The remaining Homeworld forces were dispirited or disorganized. The crystal gems had apparently won. And Rose Quartz lived on as Rose Quartz, the leader who had supposedly done the impossible. And the crystal gems carried that story as the foundation of their identity for the next 5,000 years. Now, the plan itself. Let's look at what it required. It required Pearl to carry a secret so large that it reshaped everything around her. Pearl knew Rose was Pink Diamond. She knew the shattering hadn't happened. She knew the entire founding mythology of the Crystal Gems was built on a fiction she herself had performed. Every time the other Crystal Gems talked about Rose's supposed sacrifice, about the bravery it would have taken to shatter a diamond, every time Garnet or Bismuth or any other gem processed their grief over Pink Diamond's death as a moral victory, Pearl was holding all of that silently under a direct command from the diamond she had served for thousands of years. The command, issued by Pink Diamond before the staging of the fake death, was specific. Never tell anyone what had really happened. Never tell anyone that Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. The command was more than a request. It was a diamond order, delivered to a Pearl who was constitutionally inclined to obey such orders, and the show confirms it functioned as a compulsion. Pearl literally could not speak of it, even when speaking might have prevented enormous harm. When Steven was suffering through the confusion of not knowing who his mother truly was, when the show spent seasons on his attempts to piece together a picture that Pearl had the whole time, she couldn't tell him. She covered her mouth with her own hands, a physical echo of the command she had been given, unable to even fully explain why she couldn't speak. Pearl carried that compulsion for thousands of years, from the faked death to the corruption, through the millennia of post-war Earth life. Through meeting Greg and watching Rose fall in love with a human and choose to become Steven. Through Steven's entire childhood, through all of his confusion and searching and grief, Pearl sat with the answer and wasn't allowed to give it. The question that the show raises but never fully explores is what this cost Pearl as a specific interior experience. We know the outline. We know she couldn't speak. We know the command caused her visible distress across the entire series. That moment of covering her mouth, appearing again and again, is one of the show's most consistent visual motifs. We know that when the truth finally came out, through Steven going into Pearl's memories, it didn't come because Pearl chose to tell him. It came because she found a way to let him find it without technically violating the command. She gave him a phone and had him call it so she could send a message instead of speaking. Think about that for a moment. Pearl couldn't tell Steven the most important thing he needed to know about his own life. She had to engineer a workaround, a way to technically comply with the command while still giving him access to the truth. She did this across thousands of years of compelled silence, and when she finally found the path through, it was through cleverness and care and love, not because the compulsion lifted, not because Rose released her. Rose was gone. Pink Diamond was gone. Pearl was simply stuck permanently with an instruction that could not be undone. The show is clear about the nature of what this was. It was an order given by someone with more power that functioned as ongoing psychological harm. That it was given with good intentions. Pink probably believed she was protecting everyone, believed the secret needed to stay buried, believed Pearl could handle it. Doesn't change what it was. The harm doesn't require malice to be real. And then there is the specific interaction between the secret and what the Crystal Gems knew. Pearl couldn't tell Garnet. She couldn't tell Bismuth. She couldn't tell any of them, which means that for 5,000 years the Crystal Gems had a foundation built on a deception none of them had consented to be part of, and the one person who knew the truth was under explicit command not to share it. That's what Rose Quartz left behind when she became Steven. Not just powers and a gemstone and a legacy. A Pearl still compelled to silence. A world built on a fiction. A son who would spend his childhood trying to understand a mother he could never quite reach. Partly because the people who knew her best were either compelled to keep her secrets or had never known who she really was. Part 6. The Corruption. What grief looks like at scale. The fake death worked. Pink Diamond was gone. Homeworld evacuated. And then, in the final moments of that evacuation, the thing happened that the show calls the corrupting light, and that I find myself thinking of simply as the consequence. Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond, and White Diamond, whose involvement is total even if her presence is remote, were in grief. They had lost Pink. They had lost the Earth colony. They had fought a war for thousands of years, and at the end of it, one of their own was dead and the planet they'd been trying to colonize was still in the hands of a rebel force. The rage and the grief and the loss of that converged into a single act. They combined their powers and aimed them at Earth. The corrupting light descended on the planet in a wave of blue and yellow and white, the three diamond colors combining into something that the show describes as corrupting the minds of every gem it touched. Not shattering them, not killing them. Something the characters consistently describe as worse. Every gem exposed to the corrupting light lost their sense of self. The sophisticated individual beings they had been, with their own thoughts and loyalties and memories and relationships, collapsed into something feral and enormous. Their forms became monstrous versions of their gem type. Amethysts became creatures that moved like wild animals. Quartzes became enormous roaring things. A pilot named Nephrite, one of the few corrupted gems the show lets us see clearly enough to grieve individually, became a centipede-like creature that communicated by frantic, desperate drawing when Steven briefly and partially restored her consciousness. She drew Rose. She drew the corrupting light. She drew the crystal gem symbol on her chest, claiming her identity even in the brief window where she could reach it. She knew Steven wasn't Rose. She recognized him as something like Rose, the shape of her, the resonance of the gemstone. And then she slipped back into corruption, and that was all the restoration that was available to her. 5,000 years. That is how long the corruption lasted. From the moment the light descended to the moment Steven, in the show's finale, combined his power with yellow and blue and white and reversed it. 5,000 years of beings who had been people, who had had names and histories and relationships and purposes, living as creatures in the ruins of a planet they no longer recognized, unable to remember who they were. The crystal gems spent those 5,000 years finding and containing as many corrupted gems as they could. The underground chamber in the Crystal Temple, the room Steven eventually discovers filled with bubbled gems in the show's first season, is the physical evidence of that work. Hundreds of gemstones in bubbles, stored carefully, waiting for a cure that Rose couldn't produce. She could partially heal temporarily. She could not restore. The corruption was a tear in the mind, not damage to the gemstone, and mending it required all four diamond powers working together. The cure always existed in theory. The three diamonds who had caused it didn't know about it. The one who could have completed the set didn't exist anymore as herself. She was Steven, mostly. She was a boy on the coast of a small American town, growing up and making friends and learning who he was. There's a specific thing worth sitting with about the corrupting light, which is that the diamonds didn't know what they'd done. They aimed it at Earth expecting it to destroy everyone still on the planet. They believed it had worked. They evacuated and went back to Homeworld, and lived with the knowledge that they had ended the crystal gems, that Pink's death had been avenged, that the tragedy of Earth was closed. They found out much later through Steven that the gems hadn't died, that they had been changed into something that might have been worse. And here is the part of the story that the show builds toward for its entire run. The cure always required all four of them, which means from the moment the corruption happened, the capacity to heal it existed. It just required the diamonds to work together and to acknowledge what they had done. And for 5,000 years, two of the four didn't know they needed to, and the other two didn't exist as diamonds anymore. The people who were corrupted, the ones who had been crystal gems, who had fought for the Earth, who had given everything to the cause, were the ones who paid for 5,000 years for a decision made by beings who weren't willing or able to acknowledge the cost. That is not a satisfying moral universe. It is, however, an honest one. Part 7. 6,000 Years Standing Still. The story of Spinel. Let's go back further. Before the war, before the rebellion, before rose quartz existed as anything other than a face pink diamond sometimes wore. Back to the garden and the being who was left there. Spinel was created specifically to be Pink Diamond's companion. Not a soldier, not a servant in the traditional Homeworld sense. A friend. Someone designed for play and entertainment and devoted companionship. Her gem type is unique. There is no other Spinel we meet in the show. She was made for one specific purpose, to make one specific diamond less alone, and she was built brilliantly for that purpose. She could stretch her limbs into impossible configurations. She could perform physical comedy with natural ease. She was warm and funny and entirely oriented around making someone else happy. She and Pink spent what the show implies was a significant period together in a garden. A beautiful enclosed space, a private place that was just theirs before any of the politics of colonization and empire intervened. They played together the way children play, with the kind of total, unself-conscious investment in the game that adults lose and rarely find again. The garden bloomed around them. They were, in the only real sense that matters, friends. Then Pink Diamond was given Earth. Yellow and Blue told her the colony was ready. She was leaving. The garden was behind her and the life she had lived in it, and the being who had made that life feel like something. She told Spinel they were going to play a new game. The game was, stand very still. Don't move. Wait right here. She would be back. This was the game, and the game had rules, and the first rule was to stay exactly where you were. And then she flew to Earth, and started a new life, and became someone else. Spinel stood still. She stood still while the colonization of Earth began. She stood still while the crystal gems formed and the war started. She stood still while the war lasted thousands of years. She stood still through the fake shattering of Pink Diamond. She stood still through the corrupting light. She stood still while Rose Quartz lived on Earth through millennia of post-war life, falling in love with a human, choosing to become a new life, dissolving into Steven. She stood still while Steven grew up in Beach City. She stood still through the events of all 5 seasons of the show. 6,000 years. She didn't move. The show depicts this in the movie with a single heartbreaking image. The garden, which had been vibrant and full when she was left there, now dead and overgrown and falling apart. The glass dome structure deteriorating, the pillars crumbling, and Spinel in the center of all that ruin, in exactly the position she'd been left in, perfectly still, perfectly faithful to a game that had stopped being a game the moment it started. She finally learned what had happened when Steven's broadcast reached the garden, the message he sent to the universe at the end of the main series announcing who he was and what had changed. She watched it and learned that Pink Diamond had dissolved herself into a child. She learned that Pink had gone to Earth and built a new life and never come back. Not because something had prevented her, not because she had been stopped, because she had simply moved on and kept moving on. And at some point the garden and the being standing in it stopped being part of her daily reality, until eventually they stopped being part of any reality at all. The movie doesn't tell us whether Pink's abandonment of Spinel was conscious cruelty or simple, terrible carelessness. Rebecca Sugar in interviews has described it as a reflection of immaturity and the ease with which the people we're responsible for can slip out of our awareness when we're consumed by something new. Pink wasn't a monster. She was young by Diamond standards. She was distracted and enchanted and absorbed in the extraordinary new thing she'd found. Spinel wasn't cruel enough to keep thinking about, which is, in its own way, the worst version. There is a detail in the garden that the show plants quietly in the background without commenting on it. Among the plants that grew up through the ruin of the neglected space, there are forget-me-nots. The flower, named with a specificity that can't be accidental after the act of not being forgotten. They grew in the garden where a forgotten being stood alone for 6,000 years. The movie doesn't tell us whether Pink planted them deliberately or whether they simply grew. Whether she put them there knowing she might not return and leaving the message for herself as much as anyone else, or whether they are the garden's own response to what happened in it. The show does not comment on them. They are just there, in the background of the frame, not drawing attention to themselves. That might be the most disturbing detail in the entire story. Not the corruption, not the faked death, not the compelled silence. A flower named for memory growing in the place where memory failed most completely, and no one ever says a word about it. Spinel's ending is warm, and the movie means it to be warm. She eventually makes peace with Steven. The remaining diamonds, yellow and blue and white, meet her for the first time at the end of the film, and they are immediately genuinely delighted by her. They take her with them to Homeworld. They want her around. Three ancient, damaged, slowly changing beings who have caused enormous harm across the galaxy, and are now trying to figure out what it means to do something different, finding a gem whose entire capacity is for play and companionship and joy. There is something genuinely beautiful in that, and something that sits alongside the beautiful that doesn't cancel it out. 6,000 years of waiting doesn't unhappen because the ending is good. The garden is still fallen apart. The forget-me-nots are still there, and Pink Diamond, who put her there, is not around to answer for any of it. Part 8. The Moral Ledger of Rose Quartz. By the time you reach the end of the show's run, the 5 seasons plus the movie plus Steven Universe Future, you have assembled a portrait of Rose Quartz that is genuinely difficult to hold in a single frame, which is probably exactly what Rebecca Sugar intended. Here is what the show presents as Rose's goodness. She saw beauty in organic life when the civilization she came from saw it as an obstacle. She started a rebellion on behalf of a planet she didn't have to care about. She accepted Garnet's existence as a fusion when Homeworld would have shattered her for it. She gave Steven love before she knew him, made him a tape, tried to tell him the things she thought he would need. She gave Greg what sounds, from what he describes of it, like genuine joy and genuine care. Though even that relationship contains its own complicated layer, because Greg was human and Rose was infinitely old, and how much of that was equality is hard to say. And here is the accounting on the other side. She compelled Pearl to a silence that lasted thousands of years and that caused Pearl ongoing, visible psychological damage, and she did it with a direct diamond command that Pearl had no capacity to resist. She sealed bismuth away in a bubble for over 5,000 years, lied to the other crystal gems about what had happened to her, and never told anyone the truth. Whether she intended to release bismuth eventually, whether she thought about her in the millennia after, the show doesn't say. What it does say is that bismuth was in a lion's pocket dimension for longer than the Roman Empire existed, and that was a choice Rose made. She abandoned Spinel. She didn't think about Spinel again, not in any way the show can document. Spinel waited for 6,000 years and Pink Diamond never sent a message, never went back, never gave her a reason to stop waiting. She created a human zoo, or rather Blue Diamond created it at Pink's request, as a way of preserving the humans Pink had become attached to. However well-intentioned, the result was generations of people living under alien control in a manufactured habitat, never knowing what they were or where they came from, their descendants growing up in a glass-enclosed paradise that was also, in every real sense, a prison. She allowed the crystal gems who were corrupted to simply remain in the basement, bubbled for 5,000 years. She couldn't cure them. That much is established. The cure required all 4 diamonds, and Pink was no longer available as a diamond. But she also appears not to have pursued other avenues, not to have told the remaining crystal gems the full scope of what had happened, not to have been fully transparent about why the corruption couldn't be healed by her alone. The basement was the solution she arrived at and the solution she kept. She chose, ultimately, to dissolve herself into Steven rather than to stay. The show is careful to establish that this was a genuine sacrifice. She gave up her physical form entirely, ceased to exist as Rose Quartz or as Pink Diamond, to allow a new life to come into being. But she also knew it was coming. She had time to prepare. She made a tape, and what she chose to put on the tape was tender and incomplete and conspicuously silent on all of the things Steven would most need to understand. She says she's sorry. She says she already loves him. She says the gemstone is all she can give him. She does not address Pearl's compulsion. She does not address bismuth. She does not tell him what's in the chest. She does not say what she's sorry for. The tape is the closest thing we have to Rose's own testimony, and it is, by design or by failing, incomplete. Steven's journey through the show is in large part a journey through the gaps that incomplete testimony created. Every mystery he uncovers, every truth that emerges, reveals another layer of what wasn't said. The show is structured around the progressive discovery of what the silence was hiding, and what emerges from under the silence is not a monster. It is something harder, a person who did real good and real harm simultaneously, whose love was genuine and whose failures were also genuine, and who is not available to be asked about any of it. There is a moment in Future where Steven, finally in therapy, is able to say out loud that he is angry at his mother. Not just sad, not just confused, angry. For the things she left him to carry, for the secrets he had to unearth, for the guilt he felt about things he hadn't done and the expectations he couldn't escape from a person he never met. His therapist, a human woman who doesn't fully understand the specifics but knows grief and inheritance, helps him find that. The show validates this. It says, yes, you are allowed to be angry. You can love someone and be furious at them for what they left you with. What it can't provide because she's gone is Rose's answer to that anger. Part 9. What Steven inherited. Steven Universe is the son of Greg Universe, a human who drives a van and plays music, and Rose Quartz, who was secretly Pink Diamond, an alien ruler who had been living on Earth in disguise for thousands of years. He has his mother's gemstone embedded in his stomach. He has his father's biology, which means he ages and eats and gets sick, and feels everything with the full intensity of human emotion, riding on top of it. The powers that come with the gem are considerable and have been expanding throughout the show's run. He can project a shield. He can produce healing tears. He can create protective bubbles. He can fuse with humans, which should be impossible for a gem. He can project his consciousness into dreams and into the minds of others. He can communicate with other forms of life in ways that the other crystal gems cannot. He can also, when pushed far enough, do something that the other crystal gems cannot, and that the show spends its entire follow-up series examining. In Steven Universe Future, which is set after the main series in the movie, Steven begins manifesting a power that he cannot control. When his grief and his suppressed anger spike past a certain point, his gem glows, his skin flushes a deeper pink, and something that is not quite Steven takes over. He grows larger. His touch destabilizes other gems. He generates heat and force and a barely directional energy that he has no framework for containing. The show frames this as the consequence of unprocessed trauma, and that framing is right. Steven has spent his entire life helping everyone else, carrying the weight of his mother's legacy, managing the emotional fallout of revelations and conflicts and threats that would have broken most people, and he has done almost none of his own grieving. The explosion of power in Future is what happens when all of that finally stops being containable. But it's also something else. The power that surfaces in those moments is Pink Diamond's power, specifically hers. The same cosmic force that once damaged Pink Pearl's gemstone through an outburst. The same force that, theorized through the logic of the corruption, would have caused something different from the corruption if Pink had added her power to the other 3 diamonds. It is the dark complement to her healing ability. The same gem, the same source capable of both. Steven was born with it and had no idea it was there until it started coming through. White Diamond, when she finally meets Steven on Homeworld, is convinced he is Pink Diamond. She keeps calling him Pink. She projects her consciousness into him, which she has never successfully done to an actual diamond. She could control lower gems this way, could bleach them of color and use them as puppets, but diamonds had historically been resistant. When she extracts Steven's gem, a ghostly pink Steven forms, all diamond power and no human softness. And the 2 halves of him, the gem half and the human half, have to come back together of their own accord. It works because Pink Steven, the pure gem half, reconstitutes and reaches for human Steven on his own. Not because he is commanded to, not because the hierarchy demands it, because he wants to. That is the thing the show is building toward across its entire run. The idea that the drive toward connection and wholeness is more fundamental than any system that tries to organize beings into hierarchies of purpose. But after that moment, after the healing of the corruption and the ending of the war and the peace that the show builds to with genuine and moving care, Steven is still carrying something. The powers keep being there. The trauma underneath them keeps being there. The question of who he is versus who his mother was keeps being there. He is not Pink Diamond. The show is clear about this. He is his own person, shaped by his own experiences, with his own loves and his own humor, and his own specific way of moving through the world that is nothing like either Rose Quartz or Pink Diamond. His identity is real. His selfhood is real. He is also carrying Pink Diamond's gemstone in his stomach, and sometimes when things are bad enough, Pink Diamond's power comes through whether he wants it to or not. That is the inheritance. Not just the gemstone, not just the powers, the whole accumulated weight of what Pink Diamond started, and Rose Quartz continued and Steven was born into the middle of. Every decision Pink made that caused harm, every secret Rose kept that eventually had to be uncovered, every person who was damaged by the long cascade of consequences from a diamond who wanted to be free. Steven holds all of it. Not because he caused it, but because the gem in his stomach is the thread that connects him to everything that came before. He didn't ask for it. Nobody asked him. Part 10, The Architecture of the Damage. How it all connects. There is a shape to the harm in this story if you step back far enough to see it. It's not random. It follows a logic that the show traces carefully across its full run, and that logic has everything to do with systems and silence and the way power flows through both. Start at the top. White Diamond, the most powerful being in the gem civilization, built or perpetuated a system in which every gem had a fixed purpose, and the fixed purpose was enforced absolutely. There is no appeal. There is no deviation. You are what you were made to be. And being something other than that is treated as brokenness, as defect, as something to be corrected or destroyed. That system produced Pink Diamond, a being who wanted things the system didn't have room for. Curiosity about life, connection with organic beings, freedom to be impulsive and warm and imperfect without punishment. The system had no way to accommodate those things, so it punished them repeatedly. And Pink learned from that punishment not that her desires were wrong, but that expressing them directly was dangerous. She learned to hide. She learned to perform the acceptable version of herself while the real version lived in secret in Rose's form, in the garden with Spinel, in the quiet moments with Pearl that no one else ever saw. She learned that who she was had to be managed carefully, presented selectively, kept separate from the official story of her existence. And then she built an entire rebellion on that model, a rebellion whose leader was a hidden version of herself, a rebellion whose founding principle, that gems deserved to be free to be whoever they were, was led by someone whose identity was the deepest secret in the story. The irony of that is not incidental, it is structural. Pink Diamond's rebellion for gem self-determination was, from its inception, organized around the suppression of Pink Diamond's self. The person most constrained by the gem system was also the one who built the movement against it, and she built it in a way that required continuing the constraint. She could not have the freedom she was fighting for without giving it up. She could not lead authentically without leading dishonestly. The system had shaped her so thoroughly that even her rebellion against it operated by its rules. Pearl absorbed the damage of that directly. She carried the secret for thousands of years because Pink couldn't risk the rebellion being exposed, and because the command of a diamond binds its subject even after the diamond is gone. Pearl had no agency in this. She was given a burden and told to carry it indefinitely, and the carrying of it visibly damaged her over thousands of years. And the most the show allows as acknowledgement of that damage is Pearl eventually finding a way to let Steven see the truth without technically speaking it. Bismuth got sealed away because her question was threatening. Not because she was wrong or because her solution was definitively unacceptable, but because she pushed back on the person leading the rebellion, and the person leading the rebellion could not afford to be pushed back on. Whether or not using the breaking point would have been justified, the sealing of bismuth, and the lie that accompanied it, was not a decision made from principle. It was a decision made by someone managing the complexity of being two people at once, and choosing the option that required fewer explanations. Spinel got abandoned because Pink was young and easily distracted, and the garden was behind her, and Earth was in front of her. That's the whole of it. No malice, no deliberate cruelty, just the carelessness of someone who moved on and didn't look back. And then, at the end of all of this, the corruption, which happened because the Diamonds believed Pink was dead, and the grief of that belief, combined with the loss of the colony, produced an act of devastating retaliation. The corruption was, in a very real sense, the consequence of the fake death. Pink faked her death to end a war, and the diamonds responded to that death in a way that caused thousands of gems to lose themselves for 5,000 years. Pink didn't know they would do that. She couldn't have predicted it. She believed, based on her understanding of how the diamonds thought, that they would simply cut their losses and move on. She was wrong, and the wrongness of that prediction was absorbed by everyone still on Earth when the light came down. There is no villain in this story. That is the most unsettling thing about it. Every step of the way, the people making the harmful choices were operating from something. Grief, love, fear, immaturity, the internal logic of a system that made certain choices feel like the only choices. Nobody woke up wanting to cause the scope of harm that actually occurred. And the harm occurred anyway, accumulated through a series of individually understandable decisions that combined into something catastrophic. That is the truest thing the show says. Not that there are monsters, but that harm on this scale doesn't require monsters. It just requires people and systems and the way that both of them tend to move when they're under pressure. Part 11. The Children of the Aftermath. Let's talk about who was left to pick up what was left behind. Pearl, who has been there since the beginning of everything, who served Pink Diamond and survived the rebellion, and held the secret for thousands of years and loved Rose with a devotion that crossed every boundary, and who is, throughout the entire show, visibly in the process of becoming her own person. The show's understanding of Pearl is that she came from a system that defined her entirely by her function as a servant, and that the crystal gems, and Rose in particular, gave her the space to start building an identity outside of that, which is real and valuable, and she does it. By the end of Future, Pearl is someone with her own aesthetic and her own purpose and her own relationships, someone who has genuinely grown into herself. She is also someone who was compelled to silence for millennia, who lost the being she loved most, who was left to grieve without the option of speaking fully about what she was grieving, and who has been in some form of unresolved mourning for the entire length of the show. The show gives Pearl her moments, the episode where she nearly calls a stranger who reminds her of Rose. The song she sings, like one of the finest pieces of writing in the whole series, about the specific, gutting texture of losing not just someone you love, but the world as it existed with that person in it. These are real and they are earned. What Pearl didn't get was an apology. Not a real one. Not from the person who had given her the command. The command was given, and then the person who gave it dissolved into a child, and Pearl was left holding it with no mechanism for release and no one who was able to release her from it. Steven eventually learns what his mother did to Pearl. He is furious about it. He tells Pearl he's sorry, which is not the same thing, but is what's available. Pearl tells him he doesn't need to apologize for what his mother did. He does it anyway. The scene is quiet and careful and does what it can. And what it can is genuinely moving, and it is not enough. It is not enough because the person who should have apologized is not there. Garnet, who held together as a fusion of two gems through 5,000 years of post-war Earth life, who exists as a constant act of choice and love, and the ongoing integration of two separate beings into something that is recognizably its own person. Garnet's stability across the show is striking because it is never accidental. She is always choosing to be herself, always choosing fusion, always choosing the relationship that Homeworld would have destroyed. She is, in many ways, the most deliberate person in the show, the one whose way of being requires the most continuous active investment. She also doesn't know, for most of the show, that Rose was Pink Diamond. She finds out with everyone else. The revelation is not depicted in the kind of extended detail it might deserve, and the show moves quickly past Garnet's reaction. But what we get suggests that the impact is profound. Garnet had built her entire understanding of the Crystal Gem's history on a story that was partially constructed. The liberation she had found through Rose's acceptance of her was real, but the person who had offered that acceptance was not fully who she believed. The show allows Garnet to absorb this and continue being Garnet. She is that kind of person. But the gap in what she knew is still a gap, and the show knows it. Amethyst, who wasn't part of any of this and yet whose entire existence is shaped by it, she grew in the prime kindergarten on Earth, a kindergarten started by Pink Diamond's colonization efforts. and emerged 500 years after the war ended into a world already defined by the conflict. She is an Earth gem. She was made from this planet. The planet that was almost destroyed by the empire that started the kindergarten she grew in. She carries that in her background even when the show isn't foregrounding it. The particular kind of complicated identity that comes from being a product of the very process the crystal gems were fighting against. And Steven, who was born to carry all of it, who grew up in the house attached to the crystal temple in the town built near the beach where the war happened, with the descendants of the corrupted gems stored in the basement, and the woman who led the rebellion dissolved into his stomach, who spent his childhood discovering piece by piece that the story of his origin was deeper and darker and more complex than anyone had been able to fully tell him, and that the complexity was not his fault and was also, inescapably, his inheritance. His journey through Future is the show's most explicit engagement with all of this. The unprocessed grief and guilt and anger of a being who has been carrying everyone else's weight since before he knew there was weight to carry, finally reaching the point where it has to come out. The transformation he undergoes, the monstrous form, the uncontrolled power, the way his own gem turns against him and the expression of what he's been holding, is the show's most graphic depiction of what it costs someone to absorb the damage of their history without ever being allowed to put it down. He makes it through. He gets therapy. He drives away in a van with Connie, heading towards something he hasn't defined yet. The ending is right and earned and true to the character. He is also still carrying the gemstone. It doesn't stop being there when the van drives away. The inheritance doesn't dissolve because the person who received it is ready to start a new chapter. It comes with him. It always will. What changes is that he knows how to carry it more honestly now, which is not the same as not carrying it, but is what being a person allows you. Part 12. What the songs knew. There is a thing that Rebecca Sugar built into the structure of this show that is worth talking about before we wind down, because it is part of what makes the disturbing elements of this story feel like something other than pure darkness. The songs carry what the dialogue can't quite reach. In a show that deals in systems and secrets and compelled silences, the songs are the places where the truth comes through sideways. They are not just musical interludes. They are structural. They contain lore. They foreshadow events. They do characterization at a depth that would take hours of dialogue to approximate. And they operate in the unresolved spaces of the story in a way that's unique. There's a song Pearl sings about grief in Season 3 that describes, without stating it directly, the specific texture of losing not just a person but an entire world that existed because that person was in it. It is about Rose. It is also about every kind of loss where the world you shared with someone is no longer accessible because they are no longer in it. The song doesn't explain the lore. It doesn't give Pearl's backstory. It makes you feel the shape of the loss, and the shape is enormous, and you understand something about Pearl through it that episodes of dialogue had been circling. There's a song Yellow Diamond sings in Blue Diamond's direction, while they are both, in their different ways, broken by grief over Pink, that reveals Yellow's stoic efficiency to be a management strategy for her own feeling. She is telling Blue to stop feeling and keep working. She is also singing in a key that makes it obvious that she herself is drowning. The song is about not feeling. It radiates feeling from every note. The songs are where the truth that can't be stated directly gets to be, which is not coincidental. In a show about compelled silence and hidden identity, and the things people carry without being able to say them, the songs are the formal analog for the internal life of characters who have been required to hide it. Change Your Mind, the song that ends the main series' 5th season, is both a direct address from Steven to White Diamond and a kind of declaration about the show's central belief. You don't have to be what they made you to be. You can become someone different. The past doesn't determine the future. The gem you were grown to serve is not the only self available to you. White Diamond hears it. Something shifts. The color comes back into her, literally. The grayscale she has inhabited for what seems like forever begins to give way to tone, to warmth, to the possibility of something other than the flattened world she had imposed on herself and everyone around her. That is the show's answer to the darkness it has been honest enough to depict. Not a resolution of all the harm, not an accounting that makes everything balance, just an insistence that the ability to change is still available, that the person you became under pressure is not the only person you are allowed to be, that even the most powerful, most rigid, most offended version of yourself can find a way to let something in. It doesn't undo the corruption. It doesn't release Pearl retroactively from the command. It doesn't bring back the years Spinell waited in a garden. It doesn't restore the breaking point debate to one where both sides were honestly engaged with. What it does is open the next moment. It makes the next moment possible. And sometimes that is the only resolution available, and sometimes that has to be enough. Part 13. The Reckoning That Couldn't Happen. The most honest and most disturbing element of this entire story, the thing that the show acknowledges without being able to resolve, is that the reckoning never quite happened. Rose Quartz is dead. Pink Diamond is gone. The person who cracked Pink Pearl's gem, who abandoned Spinell, who commanded Pearl to silence, who sealed bismuth, who built a rebellion on a deception. She dissolved into Steven before the show began. She left a tape. She left a gemstone. She left a son and a world that her choices had shaped in ways she may not have fully understood and certainly couldn't have predicted. There is no scene where Rose faces what she did. There is no moment where Spinell gets to tell her what the garden was like after she left. There is no conversation where Bismuth gets to ask why she chose the bubble over the truth. There is no reckoning with Pearl about the command and what it cost. The people who deserve those conversations didn't get them. And they didn't get them because the person who owed them those conversations is simply not there to have them. Steven goes to therapy and learns that he is allowed to be angry, which is genuinely necessary and genuinely good, and is also not the same thing as his mother being accountable. The show knows this. It doesn't pretend otherwise. It presents the absence of the reckoning as a central fact of the story, not a gap to be eventually filled, but a permanent condition that everyone who loved Rose or was harmed by Rose has to find a way to live inside. That is the most adult thing the show does. Not the war, not the corruption, not the darkness in the history of an alien empire. The acknowledgement that sometimes the person you need the reckoning with is not available for it. That grief and harm and love can coexist in your relationship with someone for the rest of your life with no resolution, because the resolution requires two people, and you only have access to one of them. Pearl can forgive Rose. Pearl can work through the grief and the compulsion and the loss and eventually arrive somewhere that is not just defined by the absence. She does across the show's run. Her arc is one of the most carefully constructed in the series, a journey toward genuine selfhood that is real and earned. But she cannot have the conversation. She cannot tell Rose what it was like. She cannot hear Rose say, "I didn't understand what I was asking of you. I should have found another way. I'm sorry." The VHS tape Rose made before Steven was born, in the episode where he first discovers Lion's dimension, is the closest thing. Rose trying to work out how the camera operates, asking Pearl if it's on, getting it going, and then being imperfect and incomplete in everything she says. She's practicing. She doesn't know how to do this. She's trying to say something real to someone she will never meet, and she doesn't quite manage it, and the attempt is there in the tape, visible in those first few seconds of her fumbling with the machine. That is everything Rose Quartz left that she actually meant to leave for Steven. An imperfect attempt at connection with someone she couldn't know. An apology without a list of what for. The gemstone in his stomach. The history, the powers, the consequences. Those came along without her intending them to, or at least without her being able to anticipate the full shape of them. "Is it on?" she asks Pearl, pointing the camera at herself in the dim warmth of wherever they were. Is it on? It was on. And the people she left behind have been watching ever since, trying to understand what she was really saying underneath the things she managed to say. Part 14. What you hold when you fall asleep. There is a reason this story is the kind you come back to at night, in the quiet, when the world has gotten small and still, and the things that usually fill the hours have gone away, and there is just you and whatever you've been carrying. The story of Pink Diamond is not ultimately a story about an alien empire or a gem war, or the corruption of thousands of beings across a small blue planet. It is a story about what happens when people who love each other don't have the tools, or the freedom, or the safety to say the things they most need to say. It is about love expressed as control, care expressed as captivity, devotion expressed as compelled silence. It is about what that costs the people on the receiving end of all three. It is also, and this is the part worth holding, about the beings who absorbed those costs and kept going. Pearl, who was commanded to silence and found her way to partial truth. Garnet, who existed in defiance of a system that would have destroyed her and who chose every day to keep being herself. Bismuth, who was sealed away for 5,000 years and came back still believing in something. Spinel, who waited for 6,000 years and then found people who were genuinely glad she existed. Stephen, who was born into all of this and who got in a van and drove towards something he hadn't named yet, carrying the gemstone and the history and the love and the anger all at once. They kept going. Not because the harm was resolved, not because the full reckoning happened, not because everything was healed with clean finality, but because the next moment was available and they chose to be in it. Because the ability to change is one of the fundamental things the story believes in. And that belief holds even when the person who caused the original harm is not there to change alongside you. Somewhere in Beach City, the Crystal Temple is still lit against the sky. The ocean is still there, the way it always is, constant and dark and not particularly concerned with any of this. Pearl is somewhere inside the temple, being herself. Garnet is somewhere being whole. Amethyst is somewhere being amethyst, which is to say loud and warm and taking up exactly the space she was never supposed to take up. And Stephen is on a road, somewhere, the gemstone in his stomach catching whatever light there is, heading toward the thing he hasn't defined yet. The inheritance comes with him. The story comes with him. It always will, but so does the next moment, and the one after that, and all the moments after those which belong to him and no one else, which no diamond can command and no history can predetermine, which are open and unmade and his to do something with. That is what the show leaves him with. That is what it leaves you with if you let it. The harm was real. The love was real. Both of those things are true and neither one cancels the other out. And learning to hold that, to carry the whole truth of a complicated thing without demanding it resolve into something simpler, might be the most difficult thing the show asks, and the most valuable. Get some rest. The story keeps being there when you come back to it. The Crystal Temple stays lit. The ocean stays constant. Whatever you're holding tonight, you don't have to have figured it out yet. That's okay. That's enough for now. Good night. If this is the kind of deep, slow storytelling you come back for, the subscribe button is right there. There's more coming. More shows. More nights like this one. More stories worth sitting with in the quiet. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way through. Sleep well. Script for Fall Asleep to Steven Universe's Most Disturbing Story. Part 15. The Children Pink Diamond Left Behind. Pearl, Garnet, Amethyst. We have spent time with Bismuth and Spinel with the specific, contained ways they were harmed by the choices Pink Diamond made. But there are three more beings worth looking at carefully because they are the ones who stayed closest to everything, who lived through the longest stretch of the aftermath, and whose lives carry the shape of the story in ways that only become visible when you trace the full arc. Pearl stayed. Pearl was there for the rebellion, for the war, for the fake death, for the corrupting light, for the 5,000 years of aftermath on an Earth that had been nearly destroyed by the process of trying to save it. She is the continuous thread through everything. The being who knew the most and could say the least of it, who loved the most and lost the most, who has been in the process of becoming herself for the entire length of the show, and is still not finished when the credits roll on Future. What the show does with Pearl across its run is unusual and worth articulating. It doesn't treat her grief as a problem to be solved. It doesn't offer her a tidy resolution where she processes the loss and emerges healed on the other side. It shows her in a continuous, non-linear, very human-adjacent process of figuring out who she is when who she is isn't defined primarily by the person she lost. She gets moments. The art she makes, the way her sword fighting carries in it a history of being someone who was told she was nothing and then became extraordinary through sheer devotion, the episode where she nearly calls a stranger who reminds her of Rose and then doesn't. The song she sings in the middle of season 3 that opens a window in her interior life that all the exposition in the world hadn't quite opened. She also carries visible damage that the show doesn't minimize. The covering of her mouth. The moments where the compulsion visibly strains against what she wants to do, and she simply cannot do it. The grief that keeps surfacing in unexpected places, years and millennia after its source, because grief doesn't run on a timeline that corresponds to what seems reasonable from the outside. Pearl's relationship with the truth about Rose is one of the show's most extended and careful threads. When the truth finally comes out, when Steven finds his way through Pearl's memories to the actual record of what happened, the actual moment of the fake shattering, Pearl is not suddenly free. The information is out. Steven knows. But the relief of that is complicated by the fact that the truth she'd been holding also means confronting everything the truth contains. Everything that was done and why and what it cost. The knowing is better than the not knowing. It is not simple. One of the things Pearl does in future after everything is begin to build something of her own. A workshop. Projects that are hers. The forge that Bismuth sets up becomes a kind of extension of this. Both of them, the builder and the former servant, finding in the act of making things a relationship to their own agency that their histories had made difficult to access. Pearl doesn't talk about it in the show in the way a character might narrate their arc in a lesser series. She just starts doing it, which is the show at its most quietly perceptive about how people actually change. Not through articulated realizations, but through the small, accumulative decisions of someone who is trying to live differently and succeeding incrementally. Garnet is the one whose secret the show reveals gradually and who seems, on the surface, to have the most stable relationship to the history. She knows what she is, like the fusion of ruby and sapphire. Two gems who fell in love and chose to stay together in defiance of every rule Homeworld ever made. Her existence is an act of continuous will, the choice made again and again to keep being the thing that Homeworld said should not be. She is strong in the way that things are strong when they've been tested repeatedly and have not broken. She also didn't know who Rose truly was. For the entire length of the war and the 5,000 years after it, and the seasons of the show before the reveal, Garnet believed she was following Rose Quartz, a rebel leader, a warrior who had chosen the Earth. She was not following a diamond. She was not following the being who had, in some sense, set the whole situation in motion by being granted a colony she eventually decided to resist. Finding out that Rose was Pink Diamond, that the Crystal Gem leader was the diamond whose colonization had required the rebellion, is a specific kind of revelation that the show doesn't have fully enough time to explore in Garnet's particular terms. What we get are moments. Garnet's stability is always the product of choice, never passive. She doesn't fall apart when the truth comes out because falling apart is something she has learned not to do, and that learning has happened across a very long time. But the show allows us to see in small ways that the revelation costs her something. The foundation of her understanding of her own history has shifted. The person who said yes to her existence was not entirely who she believed that person to be. She stays. Of course she stays. Garnet is not the kind of being who has the luxury of walking away from her own existence, because her existence is itself the rebellion against the system that would have ended it. But staying contains more now than it did before, because the context in which she stays has become more complicated. Amethyst is the one who carries the most unusual relationship to the history because she missed most of it. She grew in the prime kindergarten for longer than she was supposed to. The conditions of the Earth's kindergarten were different from standard, the process slower, and Amethyst emerged 500 years after the corrupting light, into a world already changed by everything that happened while she was still underground. She has no memory of the war. She has no relationship to Rose as a wartime leader. She met Rose at a specific moment. Shortly after her emergence, when she didn't know who she was or where she came from or why she was shorter than standard amethysts were supposed to be. And Rose chose to keep her, to welcome her, to tell her that she was not a mistake but someone new. The world was what it was and she could be part of it. That's the Rose that Amethyst knows. Not the leader, not the strategist. The person who found a lost gem and kept her. The show is careful about this. Amethyst's relationship to Rose's complexity is different from Garnet's or Pearl's, precisely because her access to the history is different. She knows what she was told and what she saw, and the gaps in that knowledge are different from the gaps anyone else carries. What the three of them share, Garnet and Pearl and Amethyst, is the experience of living on Earth for the entire length of the show's present-day events, in the shadow of a history they all hold differently. They are, between them, the living archive of everything that happened and everything that wasn't said. Their relationship to Steven is shaped by that. The things they tell him and the things they don't. The ways they protect him that are genuine care, and the ways they protect him that are also protecting themselves from having to open doors they've kept closed for a very long time. The show is honest about both of those things. Love and protection, care and withholding. The same duality that runs through every relationship in this story, all the way up. Part 16. The cluster, the zoo, and the costs that weren't fully tallied. Before we wind down completely, there are two threads worth naming that the show is aware of and doesn't quite finish, that hang in the space after the ending like something the narrative knows is still there. The cluster is what Homeworld did with the gem shards that accumulated from the war and the corruption. When a gem is shattered, it breaks into fragments that are still alive, still aware, still experiencing something, but in a minimal, fractured, distressed form. They can't form themselves into a whole. They're pieces of a consciousness with no way to integrate. The show establishes this slowly across its middle seasons, and what it establishes is genuinely dark. The shards are in pain. They're aware enough to suffer the fact of being fragments of themselves, unable to reconnect, unable to reform, unable to stop being what the shards of broken gems are. Homeworld took millions of these shards, from both the crystal gems and the Homeworld gems who were corrupted or killed in the war, and forced them together. They fused them against their will in a single enormous entity buried in the Earth's core. The cluster, as it's called, is a weapon designed to grow to planetary size and emerge from the Earth, destroying it in the process. It is also a monument to what the Empire did with the people it considered disposable, the broken fragments of the beings that the war ground up, repurposed as infrastructure for the next act of destruction. Steven communicates with the cluster. This is one of the show's most quietly extraordinary moments. He projects his consciousness into the Earth's core and reaches out to an entity that is millions of fractured minds all pulling in different directions, and he finds a way to help them reach something like equilibrium. Not healing, not restoration. Something more modest and more real. A way of existing together that is less agonizing than the alternative. He bubbles the cluster, which keeps it contained and gives it space to stabilize. The cluster helps the crystal gems in the final battle. It is in some sense on their side. The ending of the show heals the corrupted gems on Earth's surface. But the show does not address what happens to the cluster. Whether millions of fused gem shards could ever be restored to individual gems, to individual people, or whether the equilibrium Steven helped them find is the best available outcome and has to be accepted as such. The cluster is still down there, in the Earth's core, in its bubble, in whatever state of fractured peace Steven helped it reach. The shards that were once people are still fused. Whether they are suffering is ambiguous. Whether anything better is possible for them is a question the show raises and then leaves, because there is no clean answer available, and the show is honest enough to know that. The human zoo operates on a similar principle of enormous harm whose full accounting was never made. Blue Diamond built it. The humans who live there, the Zoomans, were shown in the show's zoo arc to have developed their own culture and to be largely content within the habitat. Some of them chose to leave when given the option. The ones who chose to leave were presumably eventually given some path to Earth and to the broader world. The ones who chose to stay remained in the habitat. But what about them? What about the generations of humans whose ancestors were taken from Earth 6,000 years ago, who have been living in controlled conditions ever since? Who exist in a world that was designed for them by beings they have no framework for understanding? The show doesn't follow this thread to its conclusion. The ending's focus is on the emotional resolution of the main cast, and the zoo and its inhabitants are left in a state of ongoing ambiguity that the narrative acknowledges by not looking too directly at it. These are not failures of the show. They are the edges of it, the places where the world it built extends beyond the story's borders. Every world that feels real has this quality, the sense that things are happening just outside the frame, that the map extends past the territory we were shown, that the characters have futures and the situations have outcomes that the story doesn't have time or space to fully depict. Steven Universe built itself large enough that the off-screen spaces feel genuinely inhabited. There is something in the Earth's core that was once millions of people. There is a habitat in space where humans live who have never seen the Earth their ancestors were taken from. These things are still true after the credits roll. The show knows they are still true and leaves them there, in the dark of the unclaimed territory, for anyone who wants to keep thinking about them. Part 17, Why This Story Stays With You. There is something specific that happens when a story is built with enough care, that the darkness in it isn't ornamental. When the difficult parts aren't there to shock or to create stakes in a cheap narrative sense, but because the story is actually trying to be honest about what harm looks like and what love looks like, and how confoundingly similar the two can appear when one of the people involved has more power than the other. Steven Universe is built that way. Rebecca Sugar and her team took a story about a boy with a magic gem on a Cartoon Network, and they put inside it some of the most carefully observed emotional truths about family and inheritance and harm and healing that children's animation has ever contained. They did it with color palettes and song lyrics and background details placed in corners of frames that you'd only find if you were paying close attention. And they did it with characters who are genuinely complicated in ways that resist the resolution that simpler stories would have offered. Pink Diamond is not a villain. She is someone who was shaped by a system that had no room for her, who tried to escape that system and partly succeeded and partly reproduced it in the escape, who caused enormous harm through a combination of genuine love and profound blind spots, and the very particular carelessness of someone accustomed to the world bending around her needs. The corruption, the compelled silence, the abandoned garden, the sealed cave. All of these are hers, and they are also the products of everything that made her what she was, and the show holds that complexity without resolving it because it would be dishonest to resolve it. Steven is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is someone who received an inheritance he didn't ask for and spent his childhood managing it, and his adolescence being broken by it, and his recovery finding out who he is when the inheritance isn't the only thing defining him. His arc is the most genuinely therapeutic story in children's animation, not in a self-help sense, but in the truest sense. It is about the actual, non-linear, painful, and beautiful process of becoming yourself when the material you're working with includes a lot of damage that isn't yours. The show's willingness to leave things unresolved, the cluster, the zoo, the breaking points question, the full accounting of what the war cost, is part of what makes it stay with you. Clean endings are satisfying. Honest endings are something else. They acknowledge that the story doesn't contain the full truth of things, that the world extends past the borders of what was shown, that some questions don't have answers that would feel true to the complexity they contain. That is the thing you're holding when you've finished watching and you just sit there for a while. Not confusion, not incompletion. The weight of something that was honest with you. The feeling of a story that didn't pretend the harm wasn't harm, or that the love wasn't love, or that either of them fully explains what happened. It's a heavy thing to hold. It's worth holding. The Crystal Temple stays lit against the sky somewhere. The ocean keeps going. The story is still there when you want to go back to it. Good night. If this is the kind of storytelling you come back for, subscribe. More of this is coming. More stories worth sitting with in the quiet hours, more late nights like this one. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. Sleep well. Part 18. The Human Side of an Alien War. Greg, Connie, and What Beach City. New the story of Pink Diamond is, as we have traced it, enormous in scale. It spans thousands of years, encompasses an interstellar empire, touches every major character in the show, and involves consequences that reshape the geology of the planet Steven lives on. And yet, the show is careful to keep it grounded in the very small and the very immediate, in the specific texture of individual human lives and what it means to be close to something cosmic, without being part of it in the cosmic sense. Greg Universe is the most sustained example of this. He is, in almost every conventional sense, an ordinary person. He plays guitar, he drives a van, he runs a car wash, he loves his son with unambiguous, uncomplicated warmth. He had, for a period in his late 20s or early 30s, a relationship with an ancient alien warrior queen who was secretly one of the four rulers of an interstellar civilization, and he appears to have experienced this primarily as, "I met someone extraordinary and fell in love with her." The extraordinary part was part of what he loved about her. Greg's perspective on Rose, and through Rose on everything else in the show's history, is grounded in the personal in a way that is genuinely useful. He didn't know about the Diamond Authority. He didn't know about the corrupting light. He didn't know, for most of Steven's childhood, about the human zoo that Blue Diamond had built, partly in response to Pink Diamond's fondness for the humans of Earth. He just knew Rose in the specific, limited way that you know someone who chooses what to show you and keeps the rest close to themselves. His grief about Rose is, the show suggests, real and ongoing and not fully resolved. He tells Steven stories about her. He keeps the photograph from Lion's Dimension. He named his son after her surname. The loss is present in him in the way that very old losses are present. Not acute, not constantly surfacing, but there, part of the structure of who he is. What he didn't know and had no framework for, even after learning everything Steven eventually tells him, is the full scope of what Rose was before she was the person he knew. Rose Quartz, the leader, the rebel, the being who had been walking the surface of this planet for thousands of years before Greg showed up with a van and a guitar and asked if she wanted to hear a song, is not the same as Pink Diamond, and understanding the full arc of the deception and its costs requires a lot more context than Greg has easy access to. The show doesn't spend much time on Greg processing the revelation that Rose was Pink Diamond. It happens late in the show's run, and Greg's response is handled briefly and with understandable bewilderment. What it does spend time on is Greg being present for Steven in the aftermath of everything, which is its own form of inheritance operating in the healthier direction. Whatever Greg received from his time with Rose, whatever the relationship gave him, he has spent his son's entire life passing on in the specific form of unconditional presence. He shows up. He stays. He makes Steven feel like the most important person in any room he's in. That is not nothing. Given everything else in Steven's inheritance, the fact that the human half of it comes with someone who simply loves him without condition or complexity is possibly the most important thing in the whole story. Connie Maheswaran represents the other version of human proximity to the cosmic. Where Greg came into the gem world sideways through love, Connie chose it deliberately. She and Steven met as children, became friends, became something more, and across the show's run she moves from interested observer to active participant to full crystal gem in training. She learns to sword fight. She fuses with Steven to form Stevani, which is its own kind of unprecedented. A fusion between a half-gem and a human, creating something entirely new in both directions. She goes to Homeworld. She faces diamonds. What Connie brings to the story is the perspective of someone who walked in knowing she was choosing something complicated and chose it anyway. Her arc is about developing the agency to participate fully in something that wasn't designed to include her, and doing so without losing the things that make her herself. The intellectual rigor, the specific determination, the relationship with her own family that the show depicts with genuine warmth and some tension, as her parents have to find their own way to understand what their daughter's life has become. The show ends with Connie in the van with Steven driving away. That image of the two of them going somewhere they haven't named yet together is the show's final statement about what Steven has that Pink Diamond never quite managed to find on Homeworld. Company, a real equal. Someone who is with him by choice rather than by compulsion or assignment or creation. Someone who sees him clearly and stays anyway, and Beach City itself. The ordinary place that the extraordinary things happened near, whose residents have been living adjacent to millennia of alien history without any framework for understanding it. Ronaldo Fryman, the fry shop owner's son who runs a conspiracy theory blog and has been cataloging evidence of paranormal activity in Beach City for years, is accidentally, repeatedly, almost entirely correct. He knows there are non-human beings living near the beach. He knows strange things happen in Beach City that don't happen elsewhere. He has evidence that he can't quite assemble into the right shape because he doesn't have the key pieces of information. He is the show's comic treatment of the idea that the truth about something enormous can be right in front of you for years and still remain inaccessible without context. The town watched alien ships appear in its sky. It watched fusion beings the size of buildings walk along its coast. It has a magical alien temple at the end of the beach that is directly connected to one of the houses people drive past every day. And Beach City keeps going. The pizza place is open. The donut shop serves customers. The artist makes art. The mechanic knows everyone's name. The mayor drives away very fast when things get bad and leaves a recorded message and hopes for the best. There is something almost true in that. The way ordinary life continues alongside extraordinary things, not because the ordinary people don't notice, but because they don't have the framework to respond. And in the absence of a framework, human beings tend to do what human beings do. Get on with it, adapt, normalize, keep the pizza place open. Beach City's response to 5,000 years of alien war residue on its doorstep is to be a slightly unusual seaside town, which is honestly very human. Part 19. The Architecture of Care. What the Show Built and Why It Holds. Steven Universe aired between 2013 and 2019, across 5 seasons and then a film and a limited epilogue series. It occupied a specific moment in the history of children's animation. A moment when the genre was beginning to understand what it was capable of, when the assumption that children's content needed to be simple and consequence-free was visibly and publicly breaking down. The show that ran alongside it, and before it, Adventure Time, had already been pushing those boundaries. Gravity Falls was doing it simultaneously. Over the Garden Wall, Hilda. A cluster of shows that were, in the same years, renegotiating what a cartoon aimed at younger audiences was permitted to contain. Steven Universe did it differently, in ways that had to do specifically with Rebecca Sugar's sensibility and the specific creative team she assembled. The show was built with a level of internal consistency that is genuinely unusual. Not just in terms of plot, where events from one season pay off 3 seasons later, but in terms of visual language, emotional logic, musical motif, color palette, and the specific way character arcs are mapped in relationship to each other across the show's full run. The color system is worth dwelling on. Every significant location in the show has a palette. Homeworld is cool, sharp, angular, with a particular aesthetic of something that was designed rather than grown. The Crystal Temple is warm and slightly chaotic, asymmetrical in the way that things that accumulate over a long time tend to be asymmetrical. White Diamond's ship is monochrome. She has, the show implies, bleached the complexity out of her immediate environment, the same way she bleaches gems who don't conform to her idea of perfection. When Steven finally reaches White and breaks through to her, color returns to her face. The blushing pink that appears in her cheeks is not just characterization. It is the visual language of the show announcing that something fundamental has shifted. The songs are structural in the same way. They are not musical interludes. They are the places where the emotional truth of scenes that the dialogue can only approach surfaces fully, where the internal life of characters who have been required to contain and manage and suppress comes through in the one form that the show treats as exempt from the usual requirements. The songs in Steven Universe are what people say when they are no longer managing the impression they make. They are the unguarded moments of a show that is, in other respects, very careful about what is shown directly. The fan community that built up around the show during its run became extraordinarily sophisticated at reading these elements. The show aired in irregular patterns. Periods of intense activity, Steven bombs they were called, when new episodes came out every weekday, followed by long gaps when nothing new appeared. During those gaps, the community analyzed what had been shown. They tracked color shifts. They parsed song lyrics. They mapped out theories. Some of those theories turned out to be right. The Rose/Pink Diamond theory had substantial evidential support built up over years of fan analysis before the show confirmed it. The show was in dialogue with its most attentive viewers in ways that shaped how those viewers experienced every reveal. The reveal of A Single Pale Rose, the episode that finally confirms what Rose was, landed in May 2018 into a conversation that had been building for years. People had the evidence. They had argued about it. Some had been certain, some had resisted. And when the episode ran and made it undeniable, the response was not just the usual reaction to a plot twist. It was the response of a community that had been doing the interpretive work for a long time and was now seeing the answer to a question they had been living with. That relationship between the show and its audience is part of why the story carries the weight it does. When something has been earned through that kind of sustained attention, the payoff reaches deeper. And the questions it leaves open, the ones we've been sitting with tonight, have been carried by an unusually attentive group of people for a long time now. They've been turned over and examined and theorized about and felt. Some of them have answers that the show declined to give. Some of them genuinely don't have answers that the show could have given honestly. The most important ones, the questions about inheritance and harm and love and the cost of keeping secrets and what we owe the people around us when our choices have consequences for them, those don't have answers that a cartoon resolution can provide. They have the answers that human beings have always had to find for themselves, which is to say, partial, provisional, ongoing, requiring continued engagement rather than a single conclusion. The show gave you the questions as fully as it could. What you do with them is yours. Part 20. One last thing. The tape, the chest, and the things left open. In an episode called Lion 3. Straight to video, Steven discovers for the first time that Lion has a pocket dimension inside his mane. He finds Rose's things there. The sword, the flag from the rebellion, the photograph of Rose and Greg, and a VHS tape. He brings the tape to the Big Donut, where Lars and Sadie let him use a borrowed VHS player in the middle of the afternoon. He watches it with them, these two people who are at their own complicated beginning of figuring out who they are to each other and who they are to themselves. And the tape opens. Rose is pointing the camera at herself in what looks like an ancient forest somewhere on Earth. She's talking to Pearl, who is presumably operating the camera. She says, "Is it on?" She says it a few times. She sounds in those first few seconds like someone who has never done anything like this before, which is probably true. She sounds present and fumbling and entirely, unmistakably real. Not ancient, not divine. Just someone who has figured out she needs to say something and hasn't figured out how. Is it on? And then she looks into the camera and starts talking, and what she says is tender and incomplete and full of love, and does not address Bismuth or the sealed cave, or the compulsion placed on Pearl, or what's in the chest. It says, "I'm sorry." It says, "I already love you." It says, "The gem is all I can give you. The rest is yours." That is her testimony. The whole of what she managed to leave him. An imperfect attempt at connection with someone she couldn't know, recorded in the middle of an ancient forest while practicing on a borrowed camera, not getting it quite right, leaving it anyway. And the chest and the dimension, which the show plants in the background of Lion's mane from the very beginning, which was present in every frame Steven ever walked through in that space, which never gets opened on screen. In the movie, in a brief shot, the lid is up. Whatever was inside, Steven eventually opened it. We don't see what was there. We don't get his reaction. The lid is up and the film moves on. Maybe it contained mementos of Pink Diamond's life before Earth, the thing she couldn't keep openly as Rose but couldn't bring herself to discard. Maybe it contained something of Spinel, some acknowledgement of the garden. Maybe it contained something for Pearl, something Rose couldn't say while Pearl was compelled to silence, and that she hoped Steven would be able to give her once everything was out in the open. We don't know. The show decided we didn't need to, which is either the most elegant possible decision or the most frustrating one, depending on how you feel about open things. I land somewhere in the middle. There is something almost right about not knowing what was in the chest. It belonged to Rose. Whatever she put in it was hers to have kept. And there is something appropriate about the fact that Steven saw it and we didn't. The tape was meant for him, and maybe the chest was too, and maybe some of what Rose left was meant for him alone. The show is still there whenever you want to go back to it. The Crystal Temple is lit against the sky. The ocean is constant and dark and full of the kind of patience that things have when they don't need anything from you. Pearl is in there somewhere, working on something. Garnet is somewhere being whole. Amethyst is somewhere being entirely herself, loudly and without apology. Steven is on a road, going somewhere he hasn't named yet. The gemstone is in his stomach. Rose's tape is presumably somewhere in the van. The chest is closed again, or open, or the memory of being opened. Whatever it is his. Good night. The mysteries keep. They always do. If you've made it all the way here, thank you. Genuinely. This kind of story deserves the time it takes. If it's the kind of storytelling you come back for, slow, immersive, late night, subscribe. More is coming. More shows, more nights like this, more stories worth sitting with in the quiet hours. Sleep well. And say hello to Beach City if you dream of it. An interlude on why this story is told at night. There is a reason the video you are watching exists in this format. Long, unhurried, narrated steadily into the dark. And it is not purely aesthetic, though the aesthetic is real. The late-night long-form video essay has become, in the last several years, its own genuine genre, and it has become one because it fills a specific need that other formats don't. Most of our waking hours are full of interruption. The pace of things requires rapid processing, rapid response, rapid movement from one thing to the next. There is rarely time in the ordinary run of a day to sit with something complicated long enough to really feel the shape of it. The mind that is trying to also do 3 other things cannot hold the weight of a story like this one and actually process what it means. But something happens in the hours when the rest of life has slowed down, when the phone has finally gone quiet, when the obligations of the day are behind you rather than ahead, when the world has gotten smaller and the only thing in it is your own thinking, and whatever is coming through your speakers or your headphones. In those hours, the mind can hold more. It can follow a longer thread without losing it. It can sit with a question that has no clean answer and not immediately demand that the question be resolved. That is when this story is best suited to be told. Not because it is depressing, though parts of it are genuinely dark, but because it requires the kind of sustained attention that only becomes available when everything else has released its claim on you for a little while. The full shape of Pink Diamond's story, the full arc from the child in the prison tower to the ancient woman who left a tape for a son she would never meet, is something you have to sit inside for a while before it gives you everything it has. The harm in it is real. The love in it is also real. Holding both of those things at once without letting one explain away the other requires a certain quality of attention that the daytime rarely permits. The night is better for it. Which is probably why, if you are watching this at whatever hour it is for you, you are watching it at that hour rather than a different one. Something in you knew you needed the quiet to hold what this story contains. That is good instinct. Trust it. The story is still there whenever you want to go back. The night is good for exactly this. Sleep well when it finds you. Part 21. What remains? When the story ends. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes after a story that has been honest with you. Not the stillness of confusion, not the stillness of an ending that didn't land, but the specific quality of quiet that follows something that gave you a lot to carry and didn't pretend that it should be easy to put down. Steven Universe does that. It has done it to the people who found it during its original run, who watched it episode by episode and went through the long gaps between Steven bombs with theories and analysis, and the slowly building sense that the story they were inside was deeper than it had initially appeared. It does it to people who find it now, who can watch the whole thing through without the waiting, and who arrive at the end of Future knowing the full shape of it all at once. In either case, what remains when the credits roll for the last time is this: a story that was honest about harm. About the way harm accumulates, about the way it passes between people who love each other, through systems that were designed to organize life but ended up constraining it, through the specific and individual failures of beings who meant well, and whose meaning well did not prevent the damage. And a story that believed with genuine conviction and without sentimentality in the possibility of change. Not easy change, not clean change. Not change that made the harm retroactively unhappen or released the people it damaged from the need to keep living with what had been done, but change that made the next moment different from the one before it. Change that was possible even for White Diamond, who had spent an unknowable length of time building a world without complexity, and who let color back in when the right voice finally reached her. Rebecca Sugar built something that deserves the care it received. The fan community that grew around it deserved the show they got, and Steven Universe deserved the full, slow, honest journey it took to find its way to an ending that was not triumphant in the simplest sense, that didn't erase the questions it had raised or pretend the cost had been repaid, but that was genuinely hopeful in the only way that feels real, which is the people who were here are still here, and the next moment is available and they are choosing to be in it. The Crystal Temple stays lit. The ocean keeps going. Somewhere in the show's world, a pink lion is sleeping on someone's front steps, aging very slowly, keeping whatever he's keeping. Somewhere in a space station orbiting a ringed planet, humans who have never seen the Earth their ancestors came from are living their small, contained lives. Somewhere in the Earth's core, millions of fused gem shards are in a bubble, in the most peace available to them. Somewhere on Homeworld, Spinel is playing with 3 diamonds who are trying to figure out how to not be what they were. And somewhere on a road, a boy with a gemstone in his stomach is driving towards something he hasn't named yet, with the person he loves, the next mile ahead of him, the whole accumulated history behind him, the window down, the world outside it. That is the ending the show chose, and it is right. It is enough to sleep on. Good night.